YouTube, how's it going? The GOAT House is back. Just before conference championship week in college football, just before we find out who is going to be in the college football playoff, the four final teams in the playoff, and I'm here to talk about the different scenarios, all the different possibilities we could see in the college football playoff based on what happens in conference championship play. If this team wins, this team loses, this upset happens, we got it all. Can a Baylor, can a Wisconsin squeeze in? We're covering it all, every single possibility. It's my favorite time of the year for college football. Just thinking about all these different possibilities. It's a very crazy video to make, coming up with all these scenarios, but we got it done. Well worth it. Very interesting. Love doing this one, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. Right before we get into all the scenarios, we have a 40K subscriber goal by 2020, so please help us out by subscribing to the channel. Full college football and NFL content here at the GOAT House. Full coverage for the bowl games. And even in the offseason, we'll have full NFL coverage, so we never stop here. We got free agency and the draft in the offseason, so always going with the sports content here. Click that like button. Check us out on Twitter at GOAT House NFL. There's a link in the description. There's also a link in the description for our Patreon. Support us and get a bunch of bonus content. Before we get on to the scenarios, you see in the thumbnail, you see 8 schools up there. 8 schools logos. Those are the ones that have a chance to get into the playoff, in my opinion. I'm putting myself in, I guess, the shoes or the minds of the committee. This isn't what the rankings are, in my opinion. I'm just kind of trying to think how they would, rank things with all these different outcomes. So these are the schools, and there are some other good schools, like a Florida, like a Penn State. Well, Penn State doesn't really have a shot to hop Florida since they don't play. Florida, I think, could be a good enough team to be in the playoff, honestly, but they don't really have a shot because of Georgia. They cannot pass Georgia, and by that, they cannot get in. I tried all these different scenarios, outcomes, couldn't get Florida in there. Why won't they be able to pass Georgia? Well, that's because if Georgia loses, they'll have the same record, but Georgia will have an SEC title loss, which has a little more value for, it's a valuable loss, as they like to call it. And the better resume, and the main part, they beat Florida head-to-head. So, in my opinion, Florida will not be able to pass Georgia. Therefore, they can't get in. I tried it. Can't happen. But to the scenarios, let's go. A bunch of different ones. First scenario, how could we get it to stay the same as the current exact rankings? How will the committee make that happen with some outcomes here? Well, this is how it would happen, remaining the same exact rankings. Ohio State beats Wisconsin. Doesn't really matter how they beat them. They just beat them in this scenario because LSU beats Georgia in a close game. Less than 10 points, we'll say. In my opinion, it doesn't really matter about the points. How many points did you win by? It's more of the feel to the game, how it was executed. I thought LSU, an example would be, I thought LSU handled Bama. I thought they dominated Bama. Score will look close, so people have their different opinions on that. But in this scenario, LSU beats Georgia in a close game. Clemson beats Virginia, as we all expect to happen. Georgia loses, but it's a close one versus LSU. We already broke that down. A week ago, I didn't think this was a possibility, but I'm starting to believe this more and more. If Georgia puts up a fight with LSU, I think even with 2 losses, I think they'd rather have them in than a Utah. There's about half the group of people that believe Utah's going to be in. There's about half the fans believe that they won't be in because maybe they're not as entertaining. Maybe they don't have the biggest fan base. I don't really think it's fair of them to say, but I see their point at the same time. So they could want Georgia in. They could just want the 4 best teams, plain and simple, no matter of the resume, and that could be their current 4. So this is a very good possibility. You also look at Georgia's resume at the same time, and they have wins over Notre Dame, Florida, Auburn. I mean, they have some big-time wins, and they've changed since the South Carolina loss. So I think this is a very good possibility. I mean, this is, if I was in the committee, what I would decide is totally different than when we're going over here. I'm putting myself in the shoes, in the minds of the committee, and seeing what they would do with all these different outcomes to conference championship week. And this would be staying the same. This is what it would look like. Ohio State versus Georgia in the first round, and LSU versus Clemson in the first round. I mean, you can make your predictions. It's fun to think about that, looking at these top 4 teams, but anything can happen there. I mean, those are 4 real good teams. I think any type of game with Ohio State, LSU, or Clemson, not to count out Georgia, but I think any of those top 3 teams playing each other would have that national championship feel, even if it wasn't the national champ. Like the LSU Clemson right there, 2 versus 3, that would have the national championship feel. Let's move on to the next scenario. We got pretty much the same thing, but Utah has squeezed in there at number 4. Ohio State beats Wisconsin. LSU, this time, they win big versus Georgia. They get a pretty comfy lead, maybe over 14 points, maybe well over 14 points there. They get a pretty comfy lead there, good lead. I don't want to say embarrassed, but they make the committee, they would be embarrassed to put Georgia in after their performance, I suppose, somewhere along those lines. Clemson beats Virginia still, and Utah wins their game versus Oregon, so they're bumped up a spot. The Pac-12 champions, which I think the Pac-12 is pretty underrated in my opinion. I don't think too many people say that, but I think it's a little underrated. And Utah, very well-balanced team. So they squeeze in. You look how that matches up. You still got that national champion feel in that first round with LSU and Clemson. Ohio State would play Utah, and Ohio State's the better team, and I would pick Ohio State to win, but I'd say because of matchup reasons, it's all about the matchup. I think Utah can actually put up some sort of fight with Ohio State. I don't think it would be, I think a lot of people, just because the name of the school, Ohio State versus Utah, I think they think Ohio State would walk all over them. I think it would be a comfortable win, but I think Utah would put up a fight at the same time. I think they got good enough defense. They're well balanced, so I wouldn't mind Utah in the playoff. I'm not one of those people that are going to complain. There's a lot of those people for some reason. So this interesting scenario there, what a lot of people expect. Next scenario, again, the same thing, pretty simple here, but this time if Utah loses and Oklahoma beats Baylor, Oklahoma gets into that 4 seed. So just a swap of Oklahoma and Utah. Oklahoma squeezes in there. To me, I've been a little disappointed with Oklahoma this year, kind of just thinking of what we expected. Expected a little more. Still a very good team, high-powered offense. Unlike the last one, Ohio State versus Oklahoma in the first round, I don't really think that would be close. I think Ohio State would handle them just fine. LSU Clemson would be an excellent game, like we've mentioned. But interesting to see if Oklahoma were in this game here. I think Oklahoma may match up better with an LSU maybe than Ohio State, actually. Whether you think LSU's better or Ohio State's better. So Oklahoma squeeze in. We see what it looks like. And we could start to talk, well, we'll get there. There's a bunch of different scenarios. But on to Baylor. Utah still loses, but Baylor and Oklahoma play each other in the Big 12 championship game. Baylor wins this game. So Baylor actually can squeeze in. And remember, in this scenario, LSU is beating Georgia good enough where they don't want to keep Georgia in. I think there's a high chance, like we talked about, that they could keep Georgia in to play Ohio State, possibly the 1-4. But in this scenario, Baylor squeezes through, and I think Baylor's chances are very slim. And it's not just because they need Utah to lose and they need to beat Oklahoma and they need Georgia to lose big, but because something we'll talk about along the way here, but it's the committee, the way the committee thinks. They prefer Oklahoma over Baylor, no matter what for the most part. I mean, obviously if Baylor wins, they're going to be ahead of Oklahoma, but you'll get what I'm saying when we move down the line here. So Baylor versus Ohio State, much like Oklahoma versus Ohio State, I don't think they would have that much of a chance there, honestly. You got to give them some kind of chance, but we're moving on, though. Let's get LSU to the 1 seed, but let's get them to the 1 seed while Ohio State wins. How could that happen? If Ohio State and LSU both win, how does LSU go to 1? If Ohio State beats Wisconsin, but it's real close, real close game, and LSU just gets a big win over Georgia, you can say obliterates them possibly. It's a dominant win. They may put LSU to 1. To me, in my opinion, where I would have LSU, and a lot of you probably watch my rankings. I also have score predictions for the conference championship games, but I would have LSU at 1 right now. To me, they've been the best team, most dominant team. I think they have the better resume. The committee likes the Big Ten a bit. There's a lot to like about it, but maybe not. I'm not as high on some Big Ten wins than they are, but it's mainly what LSU has done. So I would have them 1, but this is kind of me going in the shoes, in the head of the committee here. But if Ohio State, gets just escapes Wisconsin, and LSU just is super impressive. LSU 1, Ohio State 2, Clemson, same old Clemson. They're winning against Virginia. They're at number 3 right now. We can see down the line some different scenarios we got coming up that involves maybe Clemson shifting some spots here. And then we got the battle for 4 and kind of what we just went over. Pretty much the same thing. We started with Utah. If Utah wins, they're in. If Oklahoma wins while Utah loses, they're in. So it's an ABC. It's Utah wins, they're in. If Oklahoma wins, or the winner between Oklahoma and Baylor, if Utah loses, they're in. So it's pretty much the same thing, but one of those teams would play LSU in the first round. I would pick LSU in any of those games. I think the Big 12, even though I think Utah is better than the Big 12, the two Big 12 teams, I think the Big 12 teams would match up with LSU a little better than Utah. It's just about matchup. I like Utah better than the two Big 12 teams, but for matchup reasons, the Big 12 teams would match up better with LSU. They still wouldn't beat them, in my opinion. Ohio State, Clemson, that 2-3 still has that national championship feel, even with a different team in there. Be a hell of a game. And we're moving on to the next scenario. We got a bunch of these. This is interesting. So this one, a little bit different, just a little bit. You see, we got two Big Ten teams in the playoff here. How does that happen? Ohio State loses. So this is basically the scenario where Ohio State loses to Wisconsin. LSU still wins. Clemson still wins. And we talk about Wisconsin beats Ohio State. So how did I come up with this for? Well, I think it's pretty obvious if LSU wins, Ohio State loses, LSU is going to 1. Clemson would go to 2. That's obvious as well because they are undefeated. We got 2 undefeated teams left. They are 1 and 2. That's clear cut. Ohio State 3, Wisconsin 4. You may say, why Ohio State ahead of Wisconsin if Wisconsin just beat Ohio State? That's a good question, but if anybody asked it. But you look at where they're at now. They played each other twice. They split, all right? They split. I know Wisconsin has the Big Ten title, so that means something, but they split at the same time. Since they're split, look who had the better resume throughout the year. Well, their number one team, the committee's number one team, Ohio State. Better resume. They've already beat them up pretty big, too, even though they just lost him in this scenario. But another factor would be Wisconsin's loss to Illinois still got to sting a little bit. Still got to hurt them a little bit, so that hurts them. So I still think Ohio State, the one-loss Ohio State, would be ahead of Wisconsin, even though they just beat them. I'd be very confident about that. And some people may say, Wisconsin shouldn't even have a shot. How are they getting in? Looking at the committee, they love the Big Ten. They love the Big Ten. Wisconsin heating up here at the end of the year, beating Minnesota. Look like they're getting better on offense. And then in this scenario, beating Ohio State and winning that Big Ten that they love, that they value highly, because there's a bunch of teams in the top 25. So it does make sense. I just think they valued maybe a little too highly, but they would put Wisconsin in, to me. They even, no matter what Utah did, no matter what Oklahoma or Baylor did, they would have Wisconsin with 2 losses hop them because they beat the number 1 team in the country. They got hot at the end of the year. They won the Big Ten title. They would put them in. Now, some people may disagree. They may think they would put Utah or whoever it is in Oklahoma. I don't think so. I think the committee would put them in. So we would see LSU versus Wisconsin. We would see offense versus defense in that game. Has LSU seen Wisconsin's defense yet? But has Wisconsin seen LSU's offense yet? That's why it'd be the interesting game. I would think LSU would be the big favorites, in my opinion. Clemson, Ohio State, we've kind of seen that match in some other scenarios. Even if Ohio State lost to Wisconsin, depends on the game, I would still think Ohio State's a little better in terms of playoff push or national championship push, against the field, against the playoff field. I think they'd be better against. But that's a pretty interesting one to see Wisconsin go from, 8 to 4. Pretty wild, but I think it's very possible. More scenarios. So we got this time. Well, last time we had LSU winning, Ohio State losing. Let's flip that. Ohio State wins this time, but LSU loses. So we see the same 4 teams that are the top 4 currently, but we see Clemson get bumped up to 2. Well, it's obvious that Ohio State would stay to 1. Let's make that clear. Clemson, no surprise they bumped up to 2 because there's 2 undefeated teams left. It's got to be Ohio State, Clemson. No brainer. Georgia is at 3. They just beat LSU. Now, why Georgia over LSU? Well, they have the same record now. They just beat LSU. They have that title next to their name, SEC title, SEC champions. They have the beautiful resume, beating Notre Dame, beating Auburn, beating Florida. They would, no doubt in my mind, they would hop LSU. So a little different than the Ohio State-Wisconsin situation, but no doubt in my mind, Georgia would hop LSU. There's actually a debate here. Georgia could possibly be number 2. They could like that big, that good win over LSU enough, winning the SEC championship, getting better in the second half of the season, having those wins like I mentioned. They have those. Now they have an LSU win. They had the Florida, Auburn, Notre Dame win. They could actually put Georgia to 2, but it doesn't really matter because 2-3 is basically the same thing here. I think, most likely it's a toss-up, but I think most likely they would keep the undefeated team Clemson at 2. But then we would see Ohio State, LSU play each other in the first round. What most of us thought or still think possibly it will be the national championship game, but instead they would play each other in the first round. Then we get a Clemson, Georgia would be a heck of a game because of matchup. I think 2 of the top defenses in the country, perhaps. That would be a heck of a game. Would love to see that one as well. So even if it gets a little fancy here, some weird things start to happen, it still looks like a great playoff here. Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, LSU. So that'd be very interesting. That'd be if Georgia beats LSU. We're moving on to the next scenario here. We're getting wild. We're getting weird with it. Ohio State, number 1 team in the country, loses. LSU, the number 2 team in the country, loses. Clemson still beats Virginia, and obviously Georgia would beat LSU if we had LSU losing. So that keeps the same teams. It actually keeps the same teams. No reason to drop LSU and Ohio State out. They've had a fantastic season. They've come up short, just in their title game. But what makes up most season is the season, the regular season. But Clemson, being the only undefeated team left, would go to 1. Again, you could debate Georgia with the resume, beating LSU, winning that SEC title. They could put Georgia to 1. My money would be on keeping the undefeated Clemson, the defending champs Clemson. I think that does play a part. At 1, Georgia 2, because they beat LSU. We talked about the comparison. If Georgia beats LSU, no doubt in my mind, Georgia will be ahead of LSU. And then LSU ahead of Ohio State. That's where it gets interesting, because why drop Ohio State more than you dropped LSU? And it's a toss-up, but I think because LSU just lost to number 4 in this scenario. Ohio State lost to number 8. That matters. But also something that matters is that Ohio State already beat Wisconsin. So if they now lose to Wisconsin, it's not the best look. Maybe they're heading south, and that's where they may debate the Wisconsin who won into 4 possibly. But I think they like Ohio State too much. They would not boot them out. So this scenario is pretty crazy for Wisconsin. Any Wisconsin fans out there, this is pretty, you could definitely argue that they could be in, but you win and you beat Ohio State, but you're still out because LSU lost to Georgia, because Georgia and LSU have to be in. Who knows, though? I'm trying to predict what the committee would think. Maybe they would completely drop out LSU for Wisconsin. Maybe they would completely drop out Ohio State for Wisconsin. I just don't. I think that Illinois loss is kind of the deciding factor. To still keep them out, in this, when it's so close to LSU, Ohio State, Wisconsin, having 2 losses and one of them being Illinois. So very interesting and chaotic, and we got even more chaotic ones coming still. But scenario here that this could actually happen, and nothing. And yeah, then that brings up the debate. Do you want a rematch between the SEC championship in the playoff, Georgia versus LSU? I can argue both sides that they would want to see it and wouldn't want to see it. Maybe they wouldn't want the 2 SEC teams in the national championship game. That would be a possibility. Maybe they want to see who really is the best team. Another game would decide that. Maybe they wouldn't want to see that. So maybe they would put Ohio State at 3 to play Georgia and LSU to play Clemson, 1 versus 4. So that's a possibility too. But very interesting to see if Ohio State loses, if LSU loses. They'll both still be in. Wisconsin could still miss out, and Clemson, Georgia be the 1 and 2. Kind of weird seeing those logos in their 1 and 2 right now. What's going on in the nation right now? On to the next, and now we're on to Clemson. We're on to Clemson now. We're gonna have Clemson losing, even though it's highly, highly unlikely. Virginia's starting to heat up. They look really good against Virginia Tech, so we don't want to rule them out. Ohio State wins. LSU wins, as expected, both of those. Clemson loses, and it causes something very interesting. So Ohio State remains 1. LSU remains 2. Now, obviously, that could flip if LSU dominates Georgia. Ohio State makes it close to Wisconsin, so keep that in mind. But then Clemson loses. They still could be in. I bumped up Utah to 3 as long as they win. If Utah wins, they actually can go from not 4 but to number 3 here in this scenario. Why? Even if Georgia is close with LSU, just the thought of them moving up Georgia from currently 4 to 3 for losing, I don't see it happening. So that kind of helps, that team like Utah if they win. So you kind of can use your imagination in this scenario. If Utah wins, they would be 3. I think it goes in the order of Utah, Georgia, Oklahoma, Clemson. So this is where, and then Baylor, depending on if Baylor just obliterates Oklahoma while Clemson loses, and then maybe Utah loses as well, then they definitely can put Baylor in. But I think they would have Clemson over Baylor in still. That's kind of the bad part of the committee, and what I was talking about earlier in the video, where they're just going to, an Oklahoma win over Baylor versus a Baylor win over Oklahoma, which one's more valuable? They like Oklahoma better no matter what. It's a shame. It's wrong, but that's just kind of where it's at. There was a time during the season where Baylor had a much, much better resume than Oklahoma, but Oklahoma was still well above them. That's just how it is. So I think even with a Clemson loss, I think they would put them ahead of Baylor, even if Baylor beat Oklahoma. I think they would. So I think in this scenario, most likely, it would actually be Ohio State, LSU, Utah, and Georgia. If Georgia gets absolutely dominated, it would be Ohio State, LSU, Utah, and Oklahoma, as long as Oklahoma wins that game. So, there's a lot of different scenarios within this scenario here, because Clemson loses, just shakes things up, mainly because of Georgia, because can you put Georgia from 4-3 for losing? That's crazy. Even if they play a good game against LSU, will the committee think like that? Crazy scenario, and we're not even done yet. So now, not only does Clemson lose, but LSU loses as well. Obviously, Ohio State would be 1. We already talked about if Georgia beats LSU in the SEC championship game, no doubt in my mind, Georgia would be ahead of LSU. So Georgia's 2, LSU's 3. They wouldn't drop LSU any further than this because the body of work, the domination this season, they just lost the number 4 team. They're worthy of being in still, but we would definitely see a rematch. We definitely would see a rematch of the SEC title game in this scenario, no matter what, in my opinion, 100%. If this scenario happened, we would see a rematch of the SEC title game in the first round of the playoff 2-3. There's no doubt, because Ohio State would have to be 1, and really there's no other team that could be 2 or 3 besides the 2 SEC teams here, and Georgia would have to be 2. And to 4, same thing, pretty much. Utah, Oklahoma, Clemson, Baylor. If Baylor obliterates Oklahoma, they can hop over Clemson for their chances possibly. But it's a shame. I just don't think the committee likes – I don't think they're believers in Baylor, and it's a shame. I think I'm just predicting that's how they think. They've kind of shown that to me throughout the year. But if they dominated Oklahoma, they would have no choice as long as Utah lost, which is possible against Oregon. But Utah being number 5 team right now, they would have the first chance in. So with Clemson being out and Utah being in, along with Georgia, Ohio State versus Utah in the first round, Georgia versus LSU. So it'd be pretty interesting there. And we're moving on. We're moving on to, let's swap it. Last time we had LSU losing, Ohio State winning. Ohio State loses this time, LSU wins. And it gets pretty crazy there again. We see Wisconsin coming all the way up to the 3 seed. The 3 seed, because they would pass Clemson for losing, even with a better record of the Big 10, the Big 10 title means a lot to them. Clemson losing to Virginia hurts. That's a bad loss. So Wisconsin would hop Clemson and Georgia, and that's why they're at 3. I've talked about earlier in this video why I think Ohio State would still be ahead of Wisconsin if Wisconsin beats them in the Big 10 title. We talked about it. Better record, they split, better resume, and the Illinois loss for Wisconsin. So a lot of things factoring in there. That Ohio State would still be ahead of Wisconsin. But Ohio State can lose that Big 10 title and actually still be a 2 seed, which is crazy. Still be a 2 seed. And then we have the debate between, Utah, Georgia, Oklahoma, Clemson, Baylor. Clemson coming off a loss to Virginia. Utah would be the first option. If Georgia keeps it real close with LSU, though, they could keep Georgia at number 4. Very possible. So we can see a rematch in the first round of LSU, Georgia, and then a Big 10 battle of Ohio State, Wisconsin. A lot of outcomes there. I think the more likely would be Utah at the 4 seed. Let's just get absolutely wild now. As wild as we possibly can, which is possible. There's a chance for it. Most people say it's not going to happen, and you're probably very right, but it's still possible, and that's why we do this. Ohio State loses. Number 1 team in the country, in the nation, loses. LSU, the number 2 team, loses. Clemson, number 3 team, loses. All 3 undefeated teams, they're done. So that would mean Wisconsin would win the Big 10. So it's the same 4 teams, the same 3 teams at the top, obviously taking Clemson out, and then that Big 10 title winner, Wisconsin, in there at 4. But what do we notice here? 2 SEC, 2 Big 10. It's an SEC Big 10 playoff. Wild. We talked about if Georgia beats LSU, they will be ahead of LSU. Ohio State, I still think with a loss to Wisconsin, they would be below them. Georgia would have to shoot the 1. There's no more undefeated teams. Georgia is coming off that big SEC title win with a great resume. they would be number one. They definitely would be number one in this scenario. The debate would be LSU versus Ohio State. Kind of talked about this before. If they both lose, the more impactful loss, the negative loss would be more of Ohio State losing number 8 rather than LSU losing number 4. And also the fact that Ohio State already beat Wisconsin, so coming here late in the season at this point, does it say that Ohio State's heading in the wrong direction? So I think they would favor LSU a little more. But 2-3 is about the same thing. So we would see a Georgia versus Wisconsin. Wisconsin would get in. I think, talked about this before too. I think they would hop over. A Big Ten title means a lot to the committee, and they got hot at the right time. I think they would hop over all the other teams regardless of what they did. People would will probably debate that with me, but I think they would. So Georgia would play Wisconsin in a defensive battle, in my opinion, in the first round. And LSU would play Ohio State. Absolutely wild. If this would happen, absolutely wild. We possibly can see an SEC Big Ten final, Georgia versus Ohio State, or LSU versus Wisconsin, or we can see an all SEC final, Georgia versus LSU, or an all Big Ten final, Ohio State, Wisconsin. So either way, it would be a rematch of the conference championship game. This is a long shot, and it's crazy that the number 3 team, Clemson, is the longest shot to lose because of who they're playing, I guess. But Virginia is, you can't doubt them all that much. But, this is a long shot. But as you can see, technically, it's possible, and it would be absolutely wild with these 4 teams in the playoff. And it kind of just going to my prediction real quick, what I think will actually happen. I'm going to say we're going to go back to one scenario we already looked at. I think this. Utah very well could lose to Oregon. I think Oregon has more top-tier talent, but Utah has it throughout their roster. The more balance, and they're definitely they're better. They have better coaching, I'm trying to say here. So I think Utah win that game, but Oregon very well could win. I'm starting to believe they could keep Georgia in. I talked about that in the beginning of the video. I really think they can keep Georgia in just to keep the best 4 teams in. A loss to LSU isn't going to hurt you that much, but they're going to have to keep it somewhat close. So I am on the fence about Utah and Georgia. But if Utah loses, it goes right to the winner of the Big 12 championship game, which I think is going to be a heck of a game. So it gets very interesting. But I think this will be, I'm predicting this to be the Final Four. In my opinion, I would put LSU at 1, no matter the outcome of what they do against Georgia. I just think they're the best team in the country, but this isn't me making my rankings. We'll do that another time, like we do every single week. But this is kind of me predicting what they would do. Ohio State would play Utah. Like I said, I think Utah actually can give a fight to Ohio State just because of the matchup. Ohio State would win the game, but just because of the matchup, LSU versus Clemson would be a heck of a ball game. People are starting to sleep on Clemson a little too much. This is their time. This is playoff time. It's a very good team. Defense is very, very good. It's always been very, very good. No matter who they lost, it doesn't matter. And the offense has gotten much better as the season went on, So they definitely can beat LSU. I just like LSU scoring a lot. I think LSU is the best team in the country right now, but there's still more tests to be done. We'll make all of our predictions, my rankings, when the time is right. We'll make all the bowl game predictions when we get there. So don't worry, you're not missing out on any of my predictions. These are just scenarios here. Had a fun time doing this. Very interesting. It's really cool to see the different scenarios, what could possibly happen, who can match up with who. Pretty wild. Very tough video to make for the graphics mainly there. It got a little confusing. So I appreciate you guys very much. Please subscribe. Help us reach that goal. If you're new, we have plenty of NFL content as well. That's where we started. Even in the offseason, full free agency and NFL draft coverage. So stick with us. Please subscribe. Thank you for watching this video. That's going to do it. Goodbye.